Hey everybody, this is Eric Johnson. Welcome to It Is What It Is Productions, another episode. First off, I'd like to say thank you for the views and also thank you to the new subscribers we have. That was Tober, who was on the desk. Now he's left on the table. I'm really grateful to you guys for signing up and checking out what we're doing. For the new people, I will say this. This channel is primarily a treasure hunting channel. It all started with the Forest Fen hunt, which I was on. Went out to the Rocky Mountains looking for it, like a lot of people did. And then, of course, that ended in 2020. And now there are a couple of new hunts. Justin Posey is doing Beyond the Map's Edge. He was a Fen treasure hunter. He's very well-to-do. And then there's a guy named John Collins Black that's doing another treasure hunt that he has set up. Both of these hunts are giving away millions of dollars if you want to go look for them. And JCB, John Collins Black, his book, is called There's Treasure Inside. So you got There's Treasure Inside, and then you've got Beyond the Map's Edge. And I tend to be on the JCB side only because his boxes are all over the country, and so they're closer to people, whereas Justin Posey's is out west. I did just join a Justin Posey club because a Facebook treasure hunting friend, Candy, asked me to join, and I joined. I haven't really looked at the page yet, but maybe at some point I will. But anyway, the point is, I've said all along the way that I'm going to do things that interest me that aren't necessarily treasure related, and one of those is going to be what I'm going to do today. I'm going to do a video about a subject that I find endlessly fascinating, epigenetic memory, because it is an interesting, very interesting subject. I'd say within the last 2 years, I started saying the Lord's Prayer. Once a day, even twice a day. It came about from a general realization that there's just things. My whole life was just kind of in a rut. I also took up doing steps. Steps where you do exercise. I've lost probably 20 to 30 pounds, which is remarkable just doing that. I actually do it in my condo. I just go back and forth, and I'll knock up 4,000 steps before I even hit the porch to go out to do errands and stuff. I'm almost always hitting usually I'm hitting at least 7,000 a day. So, and you just lose weight because you exercise. The other thing is the Lord's Prayer. Now, why the Lord's Prayer? I can't really put my finger on it except to say that I started thinking about my youth and my past and the fact that I had come so far from where I was as a child, and not necessarily in a good way. When I was very young, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, literally graduated 71 in high school. So I was, high school, if you can imagine, was late 60s and then early 70s. I mean, psychedelia, Rolling Stones, Beatles, acid, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, got into a little bit of that along the way. And then just kind of generally got away from religion at all, whereas I had been up until probably 10, not rigorously involved in our local Episcopalian church, but my mother was a churchgoer in the sense that she liked to take me every Sunday. Sometimes my sisters would go, sometimes my dad would go. And, like to stay afterwards and, get your donut, and they'd have their coffee and donuts, and I get to have a donut. And, it was kind of, when you're that age, you're very young, that's kind of cool. And I said the Lord's Prayer every night. It was just part of my routine. I didn't think twice about it. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. That doxology at the end, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever, amen, is not taught as a rule in Catholic churches, but I was in an Episcopalian church. So Eric, what is all of this about? Oh, by the way, I found this. I was going through a jewelry case. This is my literal. I used to be an altar boy. I don't know if I said that, and did the whole thing with the candles and everything. And this is my. This is literally what I would wear as an altar boy. It's been in a jewelry case for years. Well, I'm not going to put it on. It doesn't look that great. There it is. So I dug it up and went, wow, it's kind of cool that I still have it. Eric, what's your point? The point is, we are embedded with memories from our ancestral past. It's called epigenetic memory. It's a real thing. It's what happens when a mother, now the trick to this is, and I've talked about this in one other video, the trick to this is that for you to inherit a memory, and they're usually traumatic, and they're kind of learning devices for children. In other words, if your parent, before they have you, obviously after they have you, you're not going to inherit the memory. But if the parent, before they have you, for instance, if a mother almost drowns to death and goes through the whole experience of, life going past her eyes and almost drowns, but then survives, you may inherit that traumatic memory, not in the sense that it's a conscious memory that you're always drowning and stuff. No, it's far more subliminal than that. But it's in your DNA. And we're going to talk a little bit about that after I talk about the Lord's Prayer, because I had to look into the Lord's Prayer. What is this prayer that I've been saying once and even twice a day for the last couple of years, and that I used to say daily up until I was 10 years old? About 10 years old. And the reason for that is, we stopped going to church when I was about 12, and that was because of the sermon at the time. My dad worked at the Pentagon. It was anti-Vietnam, and, my dad would, no more going to church, and, Mom went along with it because she was a very dutiful wife. And so I just and then I get in teenage years, and you know what happens then. Religion, prayer, it's stupid, it's idiotic. I want to make this clear. I don't go to church. I'm not, as of right now, I'm not a religious person. I hate to use it because religious people get crazy when people like me go, I'm spiritual. But I kind of feel that way. And yet I still say the Lord's Prayer, which a lot of people consider very much a religious prayer, a document. Jesus, and I studied this, Jesus did not, first of all, the Lord's Prayer is originally a Jewish prayer. And it's in the New Testament. It's in Matthew 6:9. It's in Luke 11:2-4. It's in Matthew 6:9-13. My point is that I never knew some of these facts. Jesus himself, well, first of all, the Lord's Prayer was found in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus provides it as a part of his teaching on sincere prayer. I never knew this, but Jesus used to say that you should not. This is interesting, something I certainly would never have known. The Lord, our Father, the Lord's Prayer, also known as Our Father, was taught by Jesus in response to his disciples asking him for kind of a template of how to pray. And he gave them the Lord's Prayer. In Matthew 6:9-13, it was longer. In Luke 11:2-4, it was shorter. It relies heavily on Jewish traditions, particularly the Kaddish, a Jewish prayer that praises God and asks his kingdom to come. Phrases like, hallowed be thy name and thy kingdom come, echo Jewish prayers emphasizing God's holiness and sovereignty, adapted by Jesus for his followers. The ending for that is a kingdom in the Matthew version was not in the first manuscripts. The Lord's Prayer is from about 1st century AD. It was not in that, and then it started turning up in the 2nd century AD. And that's why the Catholic Church, the original Christian church, if you will, before all the breaking up went on with Henry VIII and just people going their own different directions, they just kept it without that. But if you go to, you go to a Catholic church and hear the Lord's Prayer, and you won't hear, for thine is the kingdom, power, glory, forever and ever, amen. If you go to an Episcopalian church, you might hear it. And that was what I grew up being taught. So what is my point? Hey, Tober. Tober just made the scene. God, now his tail's on the keyboard. We go through this every time with the cat. My cat's trying to disrupt things. Anyway, the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer. There's a guy named Julian Jayne. Julian Jayne wrote a book wrote a scientific treatise. It's quite amazing the thoughts he had. He was born in 1920 in Massachusetts. He died in Canada in 1997. He was a psychologist and lecturer at Yale and Princeton universities. He's known for his groundbreaking 1976 book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. When he talks about the bicameral mind, he literally is talking about that. I think we all know from looking at pictures of an actual human brain that it's divided down the middle. I think it's got several lobes, but it's down the middle. And his theory is, which I believe in implicitly, is that the mind talks back and forth to it. Well, we have inner dialogues all the time, right? You have inner dialogues all the time with yourself. And of course, the old thing is, if you hear someone, talking to themselves openly, ooh, stay away from that guy. But we all know that when we're thinking, you can do an experiment. I found it to be true. Well, let me get back to his original premise. The premise is quite startling. The idea is that the bicameral brain, the right and the left brain, that until fairly recently, now this guy's concepts about this to me are a little, I think his timing's off, but I don't think the original premise is that bad. I think he's got a point there, but he says these things happen very recently. He said, our brains did not talk to ourselves up until very recently. He said, our brains used to be the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere would speak to the left hemisphere, and it would do so in a manner that was more like hearing voices. He actually said a remnant of that today in society is some signs of schizophrenia where people hear voices. He said that's something that was prevalent. Now that to me is a little far out, but the idea that the brain progressively went to this kind of dominant right side that just told the left side what to do to kind of get by, in the sense that, but well, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. The point he tried to make is, his work continues to provoke debate about the nature of self-awareness, mental illness, and cultural evolution. But he said we evolved into the modern brain where we just simply have an inner dialogue that goes on, and it's no longer this dominant right side and this kind of passive left side. In the old days, he said, before the mind became more sophisticated, I guess you would, he said the voices were interpreted as commands from gods, ancestors, rulers, not so much as internal thoughts. interesting. It's all extremely interesting. But the reason that I find the whole thing with the Lord's Prayer interesting is because he said that the main thing that certain things impress themselves on our DNA, and he makes it very clear there's no molecular change, but it's an inherited memory. It may not be extremely conscious in your mind, but it's subliminal. But trauma could do it. So as I was saying earlier, if you're a mother and you almost drown, and then you have a child, maybe that child will be fearful of water. Same thing with heights. Any kind of situation where a parent, I would assume it's probably more on the mother's side, the micro, whatever you call it, on the mother's side. But it could be both. But anyway, we can inherit trauma. We can inherit kind of the ghost of trauma from our ancestors, and maybe just not our parents, but actually further down the line. It's just something that's carried along. Probably it's just good for survival. I mean, maybe you need to be scared of the water. Maybe there's some, if your mother went through something, maybe there's an area of water right nearby that's very dangerous and she found out the hard way, like a riptide or something like in the ocean. Who knows? It is all this speculation, but it's theoretical and it's very well thought out. And he said up until Julian Jayne, he said up until about, he says 3,000 years ago, under social and environmental stress, the bicameral system broke down, giving rise to introspective thought rather than this kind of voice and, you understand. The thing about, and he said the other thing can be repetition. And of something. If your ancestors are constantly repeating something over the ages, it's actually in his book, he said this, repetition, he believed, could cause it to reverberate, if you will, in your consciousness, but again, always more in a subtle way. So, boy, this is a sloppy video, but I got to tell you, folks, trying to put together the Lord's Prayer and bicameral thought is not easy. Those of you that are interested in it, go get the book. I know I'm going to. I haven't done it yet. I'm going to get I'm going to go get his treatise. What was it called here? The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, 1976. Jayne proposed that human consciousness, as we know it today, is a recent cultural invention, not a biological given. His key ideas. Ancient humans operated with a split brain dynamic. One hemisphere spoke in the form of auditory hallucinogens, interpreted as gods. Sound familiar? And the other obeyed. And then he thought it because of as he said, because of social environmental stress, maybe societies beat that out of people. Maybe the people who were, quote, hearing voices, society, look at Joan of Arc. Look how it worked out for her. She was hearing voices. She ended up burned to death. Of course, she also, fought on behalf of the French against the English, but yeah, it's a little side event. But I was fascinated by the concept that something that was repeated often and often by your ancestors could kind of be inherited. And at one point, he said, did the brain talk to itself? Yes. The right hemisphere generated these voices. The left hemisphere interpreted them as external commands. This internal communication wasn't recognized as self-talk, however. It was experienced as divine or external guidance, the Lord's Prayer, as a conscious ritual. Jaynes argued that prayer emerged as a replacement for lost bicameral voices, a way to simulate divine guidance when the gods stopped speaking audibly. The Lord's Prayer then becomes a structured invocation designed to elicit a sense of divine presence, a linguistic scaffold for introspection, guiding the mind through metaphor and moral reflection. I get that out of it. A cultural echo of bicameral command, where instead of hearing a God's voice, we speak to one. Man, I tell you guys, I have so many ideas. When the pagans met the early Christians, you've all heard the stories, right? Roman was pagan. In Rome, you had to obey pagan religion. I used to think it was more like, the Roman authorities didn't really care, because the pagans seemed like they just, they believed in inducing communion with God through drugs. And I'm going to do a video on this. It's fascinating. That's why in a video one time I said the ancient pagans were having raves in the temples, because they would have you would go to these temples and they would have these young women dancing called muses. Heard that, right? This is when you find out where things really originate. And the pagans would go and they would actually have like the basins of like marijuana that they would be burning, or other drugs. And you would go to these things, they'd have the flute music and the bongos or whatever they played, and they'd have the dancing girls, and people would just commune with God. And we've heard this in the 60s and the 70s, that people were looking for divine guidance, if you will, or they just wanted to have a divine experience with drugs. And then, of course, it just turned into everyone just abused drugs to feel good, Anyway, what's my point? Like I said, tying these two together is not easy. But to keep it together, repeating prayers like the Lord's Prayer may reinforce neurological pathways associated with calm, focus, and moral reasoning. Boy, that has happened with me. I'm not kidding, folks. I'm much calmer than I was a couple of years ago. Like I said, I say the Lord's Prayer probably once or twice a day. I'm not crazy, but I don't sit around repeating it constantly. Oh, another thing I learned about this, reading all of this, was that Jesus, and we'll get back to the Lord's Prayer in a minute, because it's fascinating in and of itself because of the times that it was in. Call me crazy, but I think saying the Lord's Prayer every day has made me a calmer person, and yes, morally more self-aware. I'm not turning in, I've had a very what would you call it, hedonistic life. For years ignored religion. And I still don't go to church, folks. Understand what I'm trying to tell you. And I don't sit around reading the Bible. Except I study the Bible like I did to do this video, and I do say the Lord's Prayer. And it has made me calmer and a little bit more morally, I don't want to use the word righteous, but sure of myself. In this view, as it says here, this is from AI. I did some AI research here. Repeating prayers like the Lord's Prayer can reinforce neurological pathways associated with calm, focus, and moral reasoning. These patterns, practiced over generations, could leave epigenetic traces, subtle shifts in gene expression tied to ritual and belief. In this view, the prayer isn't just spiritual. It's a biocultural inheritance shaped by centuries of adaptation. Okay, now I kind of feel like, in my very clumsy way, I'm kind of getting back around to the Lord's Prayer with some structure to it. And sometimes I may do this over, but I have a feeling this one's going to work. You guys just have to, on these subjects, please just deal with me, because I'm not, this subject's a little complex. Picture this. For generations and generations and generations of people, their ancestors, generation after generation, repeated a certain thing. In my case, coming from a Christian background, the Lord's Prayer. It was taught to me as a very young child. As I said earlier in the video, I would say it every night when I went to bed. I said it up until preteens, probably around 8 or 9 actually, because yeah. But I was into, I would go to church and stuff up until right before teens, and then that was the end of that, and then teens happened, and that was the end of a lot of things, sort of changed a lot of things. But just picture your ancestors, whatever your faith could be, or anything in your ancestors. Keeping in mind, you come from a heritage that goes back to eternity, right? Eons, the beginning of the earth, beginning of life on earth. I guess not eternity, but you know what I'm trying to say. And so, whether you're conscious of it or not, you're probably not conscious of it. You have inherited some things. Maybe you've inherited a traumatic experience from your parents or an ancestor. It's something happened to them. But also maybe you've inherited a prayer and you're not even aware of it. Whether you're Hindu or Christian or Islamic or whatever it is, I was just thinking of Islam. Have you ever seen the things where the kids in the those schools for kids, and they rock back and forth? This is something the Jews do too in prayer, and they just repeat prayer. Jesus was against that. I never knew that until I studied that. He even told his disciples, because he said it's vanity. He said to just sit there and keep repeating a prayer is vanity. I'm not really sure what that means, but okay, if that's what he thought, fine. Here's the thing, though. Let's go back to the Lord's Prayer. You have the pagans, and you have the Romans and the pagans. Now, I always thought that, and then you had the out of the Middle East, you had in and then out of the Middle East, you had this religion come of Christianity, kind of a hybrid or offshoot of Judaism. And the clash of the two was incredible. And as we know, you could see it in movies and stuff, how the Romans would burn the Christians at the stake. That was all real. Or they'd put them in things. This new religion was considered subversive. This is something I did not know about. Why was it considered subversive? Why was it considered subversive? One very simple phrase we all recognize from that prayer. Thy kingdom come. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So it's saying, the Christians are saying, there's this place called heaven, and we're praying to a God, and we want his kingdom to exist on earth like it is in heaven. No. The Romans said, you can't be doing that. That's anti-Rome. We're the king. And of course, the Jews had kings. So Christianity was a subversive, I guess you could say, subversive religion. Remember, Jesus got in trouble with the Jews because he said, they're saying, you think you're a king? You're a king? No, we have remember King David and all them. We have our kings. And then, of course, there was a Roman rule. So the Romans were like, we're the kings. And here comes along this guy who says, well, we believe in a kingdom on earth that is of another dimension, frequency? I know, folks, it's another subject I'm fascinated with, frequencies and dimensions. And we'll touch on all these things in upcoming videos. I'm kind of getting excited the more I talk. This has been a tough one to do for me, though. Anyway, this is what I did not know. When you were a pagan in Rome, I just thought the pagans all had a good time. You know, they had their gods like Dionysius, drink, eat, drink, be merry. I guess that's more of just philosophy, but you find wine or find God through wine and sex, or find God through this or that, whatever God you prayed to that got your motors running in that regard in terms of spirituality. In pagan Rome, the Lord's Prayer wasn't explicitly banned by name, but early Christians were often persecuted for their beliefs and practices, especially when those practices conflicted with Roman religious norms. Here's how it played out. Roman religion was polytheistic and civic. Polytheistic. Many of them, right? Many gods. And civic. I didn't know this. Participation in public rituals was seen as a duty to the empire. So paganism was essentially like a state religion. Christians refused to worship Roman gods or the emperor, which made them appear disloyal and subversive. Well, I guess, yeah. The Lord's Prayer itself wasn't singled out, but Christians' worship gatherings, including prayers like the Lord's Prayer, were often held in secret. Refusing to sacrifice to Roman gods or participate in imperial cults could lead to arrest, torture, or execution. During the reigns of emperors like Decius in 249 to 251 and Diocletian 284 to 305, that's Common Era after AD, Jesus, Christians are required to prove loyalty by performing pagan sacrifices. Those who refused. So in Rome, you had to do pagan sacrifice. You had to participate. I never knew that. I thought pagans were kind of like freewheeling, like they just did what they wanted. No, it's kind of like whenever you have a state religion, whether it's paganism or Christianity, like it was, under England before we split off. The whole thing with Henry VIII splitting off from the Catholic Church because they wouldn't agree with the divorce. And, he created the Church of England and all that kind of stuff. Pagans and Christians alike were expected to participate in pagan rituals. I didn't know that. I mean, I thought, wow, if the rituals like drinking wine and eating, having a sacrifice of a cow or a bull, probably people would just be like, yeah, I'll be there anyway, barbecue. I mean, I don't know, simple thinking, but I didn't know you had to go. And of course, the Christians are like, I ain't going. Just a second, I got to close the door. And the whole time I'm thinking of this, I'm thinking, those are my ancestors. I mean, my ancestors, number one DNA percentage is Swedish, followed by German, followed by English, followed by Irish. Those are my main ones. All of those countries went Christian, especially Ireland is still very Catholic. So how much of my ancestry involved the Lord's Prayer? I'm going to guess between Swedish went Christian, Germany went Christian, England. I'm going to think a lot of my ancestors for many centuries were repeating the Lord's Prayer. Decius and Diocletian, literally said you had to attend pagan ritual and sacrifice if you're a part of our Roman Empire, and if you don't, we're going to look suspiciously at you. You are not loyal if you don't. Those who refused, including those who prayed to the Christian God instead, were punished. Some were even issued libelli, certificates proving they had. Oh, I see. If you would go to a pagan rite, they would give you a certificate proving you had been to a pagan ritual. Isn't that amazing? So you could say, yeah, I'm a Christian, but hey, look, I did my stint. You know, I went to a pagan sacrifice last week or whatever. And they're like, okay, stay on the good and narrow if you want to stay here in Rome. Early on, Rome tolerated many religions, but Christianity's exclusivity and refusal to assimilate made it a target. Isn't that always the case? That's what's going on, and by no means am I a supporter of Islamic. I don't like the religion, quite frankly, not because, I mean, a lot of Islam is taken from the Bible, right? But it's been hijacked. It has been hijacked by these militants who had just turned some of the meanings into something they're not. And the evangelistic properties of trying to spread it throughout the world with militancy is not. Why am I getting off into this now? Let's just put it this way. If you're going to be a religion and you go to a country, it's probably a good idea to try to at least assimilate to the point where people don't consider you a part, quite frankly. And that's what the Jews, that's what the Christians, the new Christians, were doing in Rome. And you'll all have seen the movies and all that where they throw them in the lion's den. Now, this is in the Bible, Daniel and the lion's den, etc. Rome tolerated religions, but Christianity just didn't assimilate, made it a target. By the 4th century AD, especially under Theodosius, paganism was suppressed, and then Christianity became the state religion, flipping the dynamic. The Lord's Prayer wasn't banned by name. Praying it in public could be a dangerous act of defiance. It was less about the words and more about who you were praying to. Well, of course, after it went Christian, everything was fine. Little known fact, but they think, and really not surprising to me, because I see sexuality as such a huge thing to do through the centuries. I think really the whole left-right dynamic is at a certain level politically a male-female thing. It's kind of feminism versus masculinity. I don't know how to put it. You know what I'm saying? And people even kind of think about conservatives are more like dad and the liberals are more like mom. But anyway, my point was going to be that they think that a lot of the turnover from paganism to Christianity was through the wives of Rome. From the common wife all the way up to the emperor's wives. They were the ones that embraced Christianity the most, and that kind of turned the whole dynamic around. So going back to this concept that, and I just think it's so fascinating, that my ancestors were saying this prayer over and over and over through the ages. And then you have all the people around the world, the Christians around the world, through the ages, that said it. And then you think of all the people who now, in our modern world, it's within their DNA. It's like an echo. And I just think that's so fascinating to know we can be affected like that. And of course, this is an interesting fact. Many scholars argue the term Lord's Prayer is a misnomer. In other words, it's misnamed. It's actually Latin, misnomer. The prayer Jesus personally prayed in John 17 is often considered the true Lord's Prayer. What we call the Lord's Prayer is better described as a model prayer, a template Jesus gave to guide others. And of course, we all know it says little things like, Jesus spoke Aramaic, not Greek or Latin. Although many of the earliest texts about Christianity are in Greek. And we're going to do a video at some point where we talk about this guy, this freaking lunatic genius guy who got a master's in ancient Greek. And he has gone back and read his version of the original versions of the Bible that were Greek. In fact, they have Greek versions, or they don't have a Jewish/Christian version, or a version that was captured by, written down by Jews. That's kind of interesting. But of course, Rome and Greece were a big part of the ancient world. They were everywhere. This is kind of interesting. This means some nuances may have shifted in translation. Actually, translation. So many parts of the Bible are mistranslated. They just came down to, these Greeks writing down their version of what a word meant, their understanding of Hebrew, and they wrote it there. Well, that actually took, to translate it for us, our people to understand, they would mean this or that. And so when you go back and you read what the original Greeks had, that they had just taken from Hebrew, and in some instances with the Hebrew, especially with the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they talk about the Essenes and stuff, some people think that was a religion associated possibly with Jesus, the Essene sect, who lived out in the desert and all that. You read some of their stuff, which there are echoes of that in the Bible. It's just fascinating stuff to me. It really is. And again, I know it sounds bizarre, this video going on like it does. I'm not a very religious person. I don't even know the last time I went to church. I don't know, when my dad died decades ago? I don't know. So here's some interesting translations that could be real. Different denominations use different words in the forgiveness line. Forgive us our debts versus trespasses versus sins. Forgive us our sins as we forgive us our. How does it go? Well, anyway, debts, trespasses, or sins. Forgive us our debts is Presbyterian, trespasses is Catholic, sins are some of the more modern translations. Forgive us our sins. I always thought forgive us our trespasses meant you overstepped a line with people, like you insulted people. This becomes just a very personal, like, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Because the only thing I could relate to is really, you get irritated when people say things that offend you, and sometimes you say things that offend other people. But yeah, sins, debts, I don't know. I guess that's kind of a clunky way of thinking about it. Because the first time I ever read that, I said, you mean this is all about financial transactions? Like, just let a few pennies here go and then forget if they owe you? Or no, that doesn't. No, it's probably just sins. I think that's the best way of looking at it. The dangerous language of the Lord's Prayer, as I said, was thy kingdom come. It was considered subversive in ancient Rome. It implied allegiance to divine kingdom over imperial rule, a quiet rebellion against Caesar. Even today, some theologians call it Christianity's most dangerous prayer because it challenges worldly power structures. Well, I mean, isn't that what the whole thing is with governments and religions? They don't like religions. They don't like people praying to a God and saying, I believe in what God tells me to do before I believe in what the state tells me to do. No. They don't like that. As I said earlier, in Matthew 6:7, Jesus warned against vain repetition just before teaching this prayer, which is interesting because, as I said, when you look at some religions, Jewish, and of course Jesus was Christian, Christianity, representing Christianity. But you do see these religions like Islam and stuff where you just say the prayers over and over and over. The whole thing with Catholicism, give me 100 Hail Marys. You know, and Jesus, I mean, I never knew this. Jesus said, no, don't do that. That's vanity. That's vain. You could say it's just stupid because you're not learning anything, just saying, it's like writing something on the chalkboard 100 times, you know. Ironically, in spite of all of its history of being considered subversive, etc., the Lord's Prayer is now one of the most repeated prayers in history, sometimes without reflection. Some argue this contradicts its original purpose as a thoughtful guide, not a rote ritual. Well, I do. When I say the Lord's Prayer, I do actually, I think about what I'm saying. And there's something, you know, I was talking to someone a while ago, and I said, you know, we were just talking about mental health and not self-help, mental health. And I said, you know something I started doing a long time ago, and it also started turning me around, was just thanking. If you don't want to say thank God, say thank the universe. I'm sure for some people that's a way to say it. Thank the universe. Okay, thank the universe. Be grateful to the universe for being here. Be thankful to the universe that your life, that you exist. I mean, you may say, well, Eric, I'm not having such a great time right now in my life. Okay, but you know what? You're here, and at least you maybe can change things for the better. I just think it helped. It never helps to sit around and be doomy and gloomy and just not appreciate anything. It's just not good for you. That's my take on it. Yeah, it's just fascinating stuff. So back to why I say the Lord's Prayer every day and the fact that I do actually feel calmer. And I have to say, I feel kind of and of course you could say, well, Eric, you're just getting older. And I said, well, yeah, I know, but what you do matters. And I could sit around every day doing nothing and maybe I'd end up like this, but I don't think so. It's just made me a little bit morally conscious, and I don't want to say righteous. I don't feel righteous. I just feel like I'm a little bit more in tune. And again, I think part of it has to do with just connecting with my DNA. This is a theme I'm becoming more and more aware of as I get older. You have all of these things in your DNA, all of this consciousness of the ages that remember, it's like the old thing, Jesus resides within you. What does that mean? Well, maybe Jesus is within your DNA. Your spirituality is within your DNA. Your ancestors have provided you with a template that comes up through your DNA. Is it conscious? Not necessarily. It's like a ghost. It's like an echo. And then if you pursue it, like I do, saying it over and over, every day, 1 or 2 times, you become, in my case, just a calmer, a little bit more secure. That's the word I've been looking for. Morally secure person, not righteous, morally secure. I know I said this before, I'm going to leave it on this. Let's talk about this before we quit here. In bicameral times, people didn't ask for guidance, they received it. We're thinking back again, the right side of the brain is telling the left side of the brain what to do, and without much reflection, you're following orders. That's what Julian Jayne believed was going on. 3,000 years ago that broke down, and we got the more introspective mind of today. That's a little hard for me to believe. It's just 3,000 years ago. We're seeing Topeki Temple in Turkey. I think it's we're seeing now these temples and structures that went back beyond 3,000 years ago. It's fascinating theory, though, the whole thing of the bicameral brain. It is fascinating theory. I'm gonna get that paper or book or whatever it is, and I'm gonna read it. But the 3,000 to me just seems too freaking recent in human evolution. I think the modern human is considered to have been around now for 100,000 years. Is that the latest? It's always changing. Do you know, I saw something the other day? I think I didn't read the article, but I'm going to go back and find it at some point, because I've always been absolutely fascinated by Neanderthals, and I think I read somewhere. I saw it was a video. You know, I'm addicted to watching videos of everything from entertainment and what's going on with Meghan and Harry to the wonkiest, you know, things about astrophysics and, you know, I mean, I just love it all. I could sit there. I spend most of my days, I think, I just sit there and try to get my steps in. I go out and have to do errands and stuff. Otherwise, I'm just learning and watching and being entertained. It's really, it's just, God, the amount of information you can get now is amazing. But, right, let's see, Jayne's argued that Julian Jayne argued that prayer emerged as a replacement for lost bicameral voices. Yeah, I don't know about that. A way to simulate divine guidance when the gods stopped speaking audibly. The Lord's Prayer then became a structured invocation designed to elicit a sense of divine presence, a linguistic scaffold for introspection, guiding the mind through metaphor and moral reflection. I realize at times I repeat, but I don't think it's a bad thing to do. That's really where I'm at when I say the Lord's Prayer. That sums it up in my mind entirely when I repeat it. It's a time for me for introspection, guiding the mind through metaphor and moral reflection, because it is in fact asking for a spiritual life to reign on earth. And I would argue to some extent that's already happening, but a lot of people aren't aware of it. And I know some of you out there that are fundamentalist Christians are going, finally, you figured it out. It's evil and sin and, you know, bad and good, and we're fighting the fight, and every day you got it. And okay. I remember I worked with a guy one time. I was talking about UFOs. Oh, that's another thing we're going to talk about also, besides treasure hunting, but I'm not going to stop talking about treasure hunting, right? I'm really excited about the Appalachian Trail, folks. I've been doing some online study, and I'm telling you, I feel pretty good. I'm feeling pretty good about the Appalachian Trail box, and I just have to, it's close enough. I feel comfortable going up there and looking. I'm going to have to set it up. I think I could get someone to come over and spend maybe a couple of days here while I jump up there. It's not that far away from me. It's not where I expected it to be. In past video I talked about it, but it's close. It's still not too far away. It's very exciting. But that's what I get out of it. More reflection and a cultural echo of bicameral command, where instead of hearing a God's voice, we speak to one. So we're talking to the God rather than the God talking to us. I'm going to close on this note. I'm going to do a video coming up at some point about the ancient pagans versus the ancient Christians and the clash. And of course, as we know, in the beginning, the Christians got their butts wiped. They got kicked. They were getting eaten in the Colosseum. They were persecuted. They were meeting in private. They were saying the Lord's Prayer in the dead of night with a little group in someone's house. And then, of course, they won. And now the pagans, if you will, or you can almost say modern day people who, quote, want to get divine inspiration through taking drugs are modern pagans. Because the big difference with the pagans and the Christians, and I'll leave it at this because this will be in a future videos, the ancient pagans believed that they could go to rituals. They could take drugs, drink, and they could, well, basically, and now they would be in an environment that was a little bit more constructed. You would have these muses. You've heard of the muses. They would be in the temples. They would kind of run the party, as it will. There would be drugs. They would just put them in basins, and they would just have these huge fires, and just being in there, you'd get stoned, right? And other drugs too, I don't know, mushrooms, whatever. The Christians, the ancient Christians, thought this was horrible. They said, no, no, no. You don't meet God through drugs. You learn from the Word what God wants. And then, of course, the Christian church said, and we'll tell you what God wants. And that's when you got into the whole concept of the church being this arbiter of spirituality, to where they controlled huge swatches of the world who looked to the priest for guidance. It's like, we have to learn from you. And of course, the church was scared to death of people getting Bibles, from the Gutenberg and the printing press. They didn't want people having the Word, the Bible, in their hand to interpret themselves. You had to go to church, and a priest had to tell you what to think. But the whole thing of the pagans and the Christians is absolutely fascinating. Something to think about. The main thing I like to do in these things is provoke thought. I don't have the answer to anything, not pretending to. I'm just stirring up stuff that I find interesting, and then let me know if you like this train of thought. I know for some people it's going to seem a bit wonky, and then I guess you'll quit watching the video at some point. I hope there are other people, though, because the people that watch my channel I have found are pretty damn smart people. I get good comments. I don't get a lot of comments. I don't know why. Maybe they watch the videos, but they don't really want to communicate or what. But I would kind of like to know if, and I see the likes, and generally likes are, every once in a while I'll get 100, but most of my videos get, likes are 70s, 80s, sometimes 90s, sometimes 60s. But on one like this, let me know if you'd like to see more stuff like this. And I hope everyone has a great day. And it might be interesting to think back on your heritage, and consider the fact that you have inherited ancient voices, ancient thoughts, fears, because of epigenetic memory. That's what it's called, epigenetic memory. All right, everybody. Have a good day. I hope you have a good day, and goodbye.